Hello, American National Government class. This is Professor Gustafson. Today is Monday, the 23rd of March. Continuing here in Chapter 12 on the presidency. I'm going to resume beginning in PowerPoint slide number 9. But if you're in the last lecture, I talked about the Whig theory, and that's the idea that the presidency is a constrained office, a legal office. In other words, what does the Constitution say a president can do? What does Article 2 say that a president can do? That's this idea of the Whig presidency, is that a presidency is constrained, a president's empowered to act within the confines of expressly granted constitutional authority. We're going to shift gears and move forward to the 20th century, beginning with Teddy Roosevelt, and he began to advocate a different conception of the presidency called the stewardship theory. And that's the idea that, and again, this is important because the modern presidency today resembles this a lot, basically very, very closely. In other words, the American presidency has been revolutionized by this concept that was advanced by a progressive, Teddy Roosevelt, and also Woodrow Wilson and others. But the stewardship theory calls for a strong presidency that is limited not by what the Constitution allows, but by what it prohibits. Presidents are free to act as they choose as long as they don't take actions denied by law. In other words, if it says you can't, then you can't. But if it doesn't specifically say you can't, perhaps you can. All right, it's a much more fluid and as you can imagine, permissive view of the presidency. And so what it did is that the stewardship theory shifted from the Whig theory to the stewardship theory, obviously. It shifted from a conception of the presidency as a legal executive to a political executive. In other words, when the president is a legal executive, what that means is that basically the president is confined by what is written in Article 2 of the Constitution. The stewardship concept embraces a much more permissive conception of the presidency, or a political conception of the presidency, where a president's power is now limited by or emboldened by public opinion. Okay, so in other words, this is where you get the beginning of public opinion polls. Prior to the 20th century, there was really no such thing as a public opinion poll. In other words, you didn't see, George Washington fretting in the Oval Office. I don't even know if there was an Oval Office then. I don't think there was. But, fretting in his office, wondering whether or not, the public opinion polls are going to give him enough political clout that he can make a particular decision with Alexander Hamilton for the American, for a national bank or something like that. In other words, the stewardship theory began to cause presidents to look very closely at what the people wanted. In other words, this idea that the president is a steward of the people. He represents what the people want. So under this conception of the presidency, you get this idea that the president has a mandate. In other words, if a president is elected with a 65% popular vote, the argument is, hey, 65% of the American people want this president, so this president has a mandate from the people, and he should do exactly what the people wanted him to do. Okay, in other words, that is very much a stewardship theory conception. That is very much a political conception of the presidency. So you can see this expressed in speeches and writings by Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. I'm going to look at one of them by Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, if you go to slide number 11, this is a speech he gave campaigning for president called "Making an Old Party Progressive." And he said this, he said, "The most important factor in getting the right spirit in my administration, next to the insistence upon courage, honesty, and genuine democracy of desire to serve the plain people, was my insistence upon the theory that executive power was limited only by specific restrictions and prohibitions appearing in the Constitution or imposed by the Congress under its constitutional powers. My view was that every executive offer, and above all, every executive offer in high position was there's that word, a steward of the people, bound actively and affirmatively to do all he could for the people and not to content himself with the negative merit of keeping his talents undamaged in a napkin. Moving on to slide number 12. I declined to adopt the view that what was imperatively necessary for the nation was to be done by the president unless you could find some specific authorization to do it. My belief is that it was not only his right but his duty to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded unless such action was forbidden by the Constitution or by the laws. Under this interpretation of executive power, I did and caused to be done many things not previously done by the president and the heads of departments. I did not usurp power, but I did greatly broaden the use of executive power. In other words, I acted for the public welfare. I acted for the common well-being of all of our people whenever and in whatever manner was necessary, unless prevented directly by constitutional or legislative prohibition. Again, he's trying to say, listen, if it doesn't say I can't, then I can. And then he goes on to say, if you look at slide number 13, I have to make it bigger here because I'm not able to read it all. I believed in invoking the national power with absolute freedom for every national need, and I believe that the Constitution should be treated as the greatest document ever devised by the wit of man to aid a people in exercising every power necessary for its own betterment, and not as a straitjacket cunningly fashioned to strangle growth. Again, that last phrase is really, really significant, and that is very much a progressive initiative, is the idea that government must be efficient. Government must get things done. In other words, the progressives began to look at the constitutional limitations set by the founders, the separation of powers and federalism, and again, limiting the power of the federal government by enumerated powers as a problem and not a solution. Okay, again, the progressives had a much more positive view of human nature. So they saw any attempt by the Constitution to limit government's ability to be efficient, or to, in this case, it says, if growth is being strangled, that's a problem. In other words, for progressives, it's always a good thing for the government to grow. Okay, and so one of the ways that they thought the government could grow and should grow is that the office of the presidency should shift from a limited legal executive to a much more expansive political executive, connected to the will and the expression of the American people. Now, moving along here, go to slide number 14, we'll see a writing from Woodrow Wilson from, I believe this is a book, The President of the United States. Again, you can see the change conception here of government envisioned by the progressives is that government should keep getting bigger because government is the solution, not the problem. Okay, that was a big argument of progressives, is that the American people need government to get bigger because, again, human nature is basically good in their logic. So you can give more and more power to the government and it can get more things done and efficiently for the American people. So on slide number 14, Wilson says this: governments are living things and operate as organic wholes. Moreover, governments have their natural evolution and are one thing in one age and another in another. The makers of the Constitution constructed the federal government upon a theory of checks and balances, which was meant to limit the operation of each part and allow no single part or organ of it a dominating force. But no government can be successfully conducted upon so mechanical a theory. Leadership and control must be lodged somewhere. So again, you see Wilson bristling at the constitutional checks and balances of what the framers created in 1787. Moving on to slide number 15. The makers of the Constitution seem to have thought of the president of that stricter Whig theorists, which the king to be only a legal executive, the presiding and guiding authority in his application of law and the execution of policy. His veto upon legislation was only his check on Congress. It was a power of restraint, not guidance. So again, looking at government must guide, it must not be restrained. Government is a good thing that must be empowered. He was empowered to prevent bad laws, but he was not given an opportunity to make good ones. As a matter of fact, he has become very much more. He has become the leader of his party and the guide of the nation in political purpose and therefore in legal action. The constitutional structure of the government has hampered and limited his action in these significant roles, but it has not prevented it. Again, the next slide. Our government is a living, organic thing and must, like every other government, work out the close synthesis of active parts, which can exist only when leadership is lodged in some one man or group of men. So you can see him beginning to argue that one person in charge of everything is actually a really good thing. Again, think through our constitutional system. We've got three co-equal branches of government: the legislative branch in Article 1, the executive branch in Article 2, and then the judicial branch in Article 3. They are co-equal. One is not supposed to be higher than the other. Again, they're all supposed to check each other. They're all supposed to be at the same level. What you see Wilson arguing for here is the presidency actually elevated above the legislature in particular, and perhaps the courts. He says, you cannot compound a successful government out of antagonisms. Greatly as the practice and influence of presidents is varied, there can be no mistaking the fact that what has grown more and more inclined from generation to generation is for us to look at the president as the unifying force in our complex system, the leader both of his party and of the nation. To do so is not inconsistent with the actual provisions of the Constitution. It is only inconsistent with the very mechanical theory of its meaning and intention. And then going to slide number 17 there, let me just read this. It is therefore becoming more and more true as the business of the government becomes more and more complex and extended, the president is becoming more and more a political and less an executive officer. Again, you can replace the word executive for legal. Okay, so again, you're seeing Wilson argue for a much larger conception of the presidency. And remember, I think I said this in class when we were actually together in the good old days, but Woodrow Wilson was an Anglophile. He loved the Brits. He loved the British system. He loved the British parliamentary system. So remember, in the British parliamentary system, the head of the executive branch is the prime minister. But the prime minister is also the head of the leading or dominant party within Parliament, or at least within the House of Commons. So in their system, in one person, you've got the head of the executive branch and the head of the legislative branch. Okay, so basically, the executive there, the prime minister can move as one. So he's not hindered by a check on the Parliament, or the House of Commons rather, keeping him from doing what he wants. And of course, there's opposition parties, and he has to, I believe it's every Monday morning or Tuesday morning, he has to stand before the Parliament, especially the opposing party, and answer questions. So there is a check that way. But by and large, that prime minister can get things done very, very quickly. This is exactly what Wilson was arguing for in this speech. Again, if you go to slide number 18, again, you can see a continuation of this logic. He said the president is at liberty both in law and conscience to be as big a man as he can. His capacity will set the limit. In other words, the size of the presidency is not limited by the Constitution, but by his personality. If he's got a weak personality, small presidency. Big personality, again, think Theodore Roosevelt. There's a guy that was kind of larger than life and basically really, really expanded the powers of the presidency, okay? His capacity will set the limit, and if Congress is overborne by him, in other words, if the president rides roughshod over Congress and basically does things that Congress can't control, he says, it's no fault of the Constitution. It will be from no lack of constitutional powers on its part, but only because the president has the nation behind him and Congress is not. Again, there's that idea of a national mandate, is that forget about the limitations imposed within the Constitution that Congress can limit the president. Hey, if the vast majority of Americans want it, then the president is basically the steward of the people and he must give it to them. He has no means of compelling Congress except through public opinion. Again, there's that idea of public opinion polls, okay, that they become very, very important, okay? And you can see a modern expression of this if you go to slide number 19, okay? And this is a quote from President Barack Obama in a cabinet meeting in January 14, 2014, okay? Again, this is a great expression of what I call government by fiat, okay? In other words, government by presidential pronouncement instead of government by legislative deliberation, okay, where there's kind of this give and take by Congress, and they kind of deliberate, and Congress passes a law that both the House and the Senate desire, and then it's given to the president and they sign it. That reflects consensus. Whereas government by fiat is executive orders. Okay, a president can't wait, or he can't get the votes in Congress to get something done, so he just, by the stroke of his pen, creates an executive order and gets it done. Again, this is a good example of the stewardship theory in action. Let me just read this quote. So this is what Obama said, President Obama said, "We are not just going to be waiting for legislation in order to make sure that we're providing Americans the help that they need. I've got a pen and I've got a phone, and I can use that pen to sign executive orders and take executive actions, administrative actions that move the ball forward in helping to make sure our kids are getting the best education possible, making sure that our businesses are getting the kind of support and help that they need to grow and advance, to make sure that people are getting skills that they need to get those jobs that our businesses are creating." Again, I'm not waiting for Congress. I'm going to get it done myself, okay? So again, another quote is, again, you look at the very next slide there, Harry Truman. Again, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the stewardship theory, this is not a Democrat thing. This is not a Republican thing, okay? Both parties generally embrace this concept of the stewardship theory, okay? And here's, again, the last quote I want to give before I conclude this lecture, this video. Harry Truman said, "The power of the president should be used in the interest of the people, and in order to do that, the president must use whatever power the Constitution does not expressly deny him." So again, I'm prohibited to do what the Constitution says I can't, but if it doesn't say I can't, then perhaps I can. Okay, so again, I'll continue this on, but again, I'll talk to you next time virtually via these videos. So talk to you soon. Take care.